Well, hi. Thanks for coming to my talk. So today I wanted to go over a little bit about some research and studying and talking with people that I've done that really covers the way they think about measuring, or to use one of these fun made up words, metricing, what they're doing with regards to not only DevOps, but getting better with their software and tracking how they are improving the way their organization does software, tracking the software process itself, and then also tracking, as is always interesting to ops people. I just covered the dev people, like how it's running and kind of the health checks, metrics, as we'll call it, as we used to call it, as I'll regale you with my glorious past history there. But then the other part, there's the other part that I wanted to go over is more of the, not so much the development and the operations part, but both the, whether it's for a nonprofit, the business part of it, like what how your organization is tracking, how your software is doing, how it's helping the organization do what they want. And then also, because a lot of when we're talking about doing DevOps and Agile, or if you'll pardon the phrase, digital transformation, as is in there, transformation, a lot of what you're doing is changing how your organization works, its structure, what people will call the culture, the norms that it has. And I think having metrics around those are also interesting to pay attention to, just so you know how you're doing and to start to track things. And also, people love metrics. They ask about that quite a lot. So, I work for a large, big public company, all sorts of disclaimers about things there. I suggest you print this out and enjoy reading between sessions. You might want to keep it in your back pocket, but just, a disclaimer, things you should know about. So this is me. There's a large picture of me. I've been lucky to, I started working at Pivotal, which was acquired by VMware a couple of years ago. But I've worked around here for about 7 or so years, and I'm in a nice position where what I do is I talk with our customers and other large organizations about how they're thinking about when it comes to their custom written software, the software that they write on their own, whether it's, you could think about like mortgage approval applications, the retail sites you go to. In the government space, there's all sorts of workflow things like getting a driver's license or paying your taxes, to bring up one most people don't like. But I talk with those organizations about how they are doing software and how they're improving at an organization level, how they're doing software. And I have 3 booklets that I've kind of captured over the years, the findings that I've had, you can check out. And I do a couple of podcasts over there if you're interested in hearing my voice now and following along the prattle of kind of what's happening in that enterprisey infrastructure area of writing your own software and running it, and the people who manage it. But you can go to my URLs and engage with my brand if you're really interested. But I'll save that again for your own free time if you care. So to give you a bit of an overview, to kind of give some more detail to the overview I started with, these are, when I think about metrics, these are the 3 areas I kind of group them together, the 3 things that I think are useful looking at when it comes to metrics. And I'm going to go over each of these, as you can imagine. And this isn't an exhaustive total list of metrics. They're just a couple under each category that I think are good to look at and good to start tracking and thinking about. And as I mentioned, I mean, I think a lot of what, if you've read anything about DevOps or site reliability engineer, or just anything about operations and writing software nowadays, there's probably several of these that you've encountered. But as we move to the right side, I find some of those a little more difficult to get to, right? So some of these are kind of obvious, and some of them are others that have come about as I've talked with organizations more and more. And I think, I especially want to, I'll start off with the technical side and get to the other, but I especially want to highlight, like, I think it's important to pay attention to all of these, whether you're a developer or a manager of developers or an operations person, because, there's all sorts of survey numbers. In fact, a recent one from Forrester goes over that. Just they ask developers how they track their success, and just about 30% of them say that they focus on, to use another fun phrase, the business outcomes, right? Like, what was the actual effect? Never mind the kind of speeds and feeds and like the kind of gauges of what they're doing, but is the software they're doing actually useful? Is it solving people's problems? And I think when you kind of move across to the right, as you track those metrics, that's how you get to answer this question of the usefulness of what you're doing. So I've been mentioning a lot of like people who use their own software to improve the way their business or their organization functions, right? And transforming to doing things. And that's a lot of, I'm sure with a lot of talks you see, everyone's telling you how the pace of business is changing more than ever. Software is eating the world, and you do got to transform and all of those things. That all sounds great. But I always like to at least start with kind of a baseline example of what that means. And this example is a bit old nowadays, in a vintagey kind of way. It happened several years ago, as you can see in the footnotes. But it's a good, simple example of what it means to get better at software and why you would think about doing all the transformation and the changes that would cause you to need and benefit from the metrics that I'm going to talk about. So this is an example from the IRS. You'll know what that is if you're in the United States. It's the Internal Revenue Service, the tax collectors, and maybe assessors. Anyways, it's the tax collectors in the US. And so this is an example, like I said, from a while ago. And every now and then, I'm sure you've never had this problem where you do not pay your taxes on time, you're delinquent. But sometimes that occurs with people. And what the IRS does is they have this great notification system where every day you owe more in penalty. And of course, they would like you to pay your taxes, right? And usually people who are delinquent would also like to pay their taxes so that they don't have to owe more. And so in order to do that, all apart from the software, what you have to do is find out what your balance is for that day, the day that you're going to find it, because, it increases every day. And so classically or traditionally, the way that would be done is you would call the IRS. You would find out a number and call a call center. Now, this is a workflow, a process, the way the organization is working, right? And the problem with the call center thing, one, who wants to call anyone on the phone? That doesn't sound exciting, let alone someone who you're going to give a bunch of money to. People don't like talking to tax people, I assume. And so already you've got this bad sort of customer experience, unfortunately. And then also it's costly to employ those people, train them, and kind of keep them up and running. And in fact, also as we would say in a technical way, the reliability, the uptime of that service was not so great. As you can see from, if you could click on this, you could go see a study that showed that, every now and then, I forget the period, but essentially only 37% of the time this service, someone answering the phone, was available. And the other times, I'm not really sure what would happen, but people wouldn't get through to them. They were lost in hold land, or maybe the phone would just hang up, or it was after hours. But from a perspective, if you're thinking about running software, right? If you had 37% availability, that would probably be a big problem if your software only worked 37% of the time. And I would try to impress you with the math. Let's see. I'll do it. That means that you got that means 63% of the time it wasn't working, which is a more astounding figure. So, like a lot of organizations who are thinking, why don't we use software to solve a business problem? Not only solve the problem, but also make it better, right? Why don't we solve this problem that we have? The availability is bad. The experience is bad. No one enjoys it, probably on either side. We could use software to do that. So the IRS kicked off this project to come up with, let's have a way that you can go log on and look up the taxes that you owe, which is a simple enough thing to do, right? And like a lot of the traditional way of doing software, what everyone does, the stakeholders, the people who kind of own the business, the business analysts, if you call them that, the project managers, you might throw a scrum master or two in there, an enterprise architect, some designers and developers. They kind of all sit down and write up what everything is going to be, even maybe make some wireframes, and the developers go off and do it. And then after a year, they deliver it, and people can start using the software. Now, usually what happens, if you think about this long period of time, is you have 12 months, sometimes even more, before you know if you made the right decisions, right? You haven't actually validated with actual data, like seeing what people do and if they solve the problems. You haven't validated that you have made the right theories, that you've made the right choices. Now, thankfully with software, if you do software well, or I shouldn't say well, if you do software in a way that makes this possible, I mean, software, for better or worse, is very easy to change. You can change it quickly. Like, you can make minor changes in a day and get it all the way to production if you have the right kind of setup, probably more like a week or so for going through all of the rigmarole that you need to. But you have to have this in mind of taking this design perspective of, instead of after 12 months deploying something, let's test it out and validate if we had the right idea or not. So that's a little pre-pending for what is going on in this story. So the initial idea that the IRS had was what you see on the left side, the before side, which is, being kind of accountants and people like that. I think their idea was like people would want to see their entire transactions, their kind of memories with the IRS, and we will show them that, and they can figure out what their balance is from that. And then, because they're seeing the ledger, they'll know that they have to pay this amount, and then they can go and pay that. And I've highlighted, or I haven't, the people who put these screens together highlighted in orange what you would pick out from the ledger. And it's also a simplified one. You log into your bank or your credit card or whatever, you kind of get an idea of all the transactions in the ledger you would have. So what this team found, when instead of deploying it in a 12-month cycle, they deployed it more frequently and got it in front of users, is they put this in front of users, and they found that people were still confused about how much they owed. And a distressing amount of them wanted to pick up the phone and call to get clarification about what they were doing. So, I was saying it's important for developers to measure their success based on the business outcome, based on how their software is used, right? And by that outcome, their software, no matter how well their software compiled, ran through code, and performed, their software would not have been a success because they wouldn't have solved the core problem. People would still want to pick up the phone. You would still have the costs associated with that, the bad customer service. But thankfully, because they were getting this data about what people are actually doing, they were validating their theories, they were able to test out more theories. And finally, by having shorter cycles and testing out new things and getting it in front of users, they arrived at, which in retrospect, as with all these kind of stories, seems very obvious, but if you've ever worked on this kind of thing, you know that it's never obvious and it takes a lot of work to get to it. What you see on the right side is that it turns out when people want to know how much money they owe the IRS, all they want to know is how much money they owe the IRS. They don't want to have like that Facebook memories thing where they kind of see what was happening 5 years ago this day with the IRS and kind of traipse down memory row. And, as you can see on the side over there, this actually, it's like I said, it's quite some time since I gathered these numbers. So I'm sure the amount of taxes that they've run through here, if you're thinking commercially, the revenue, as is the name of the IRS that they brought in, has gone up. They have people using it. So it's allowed them to really accomplish those original business goals and do even more. And you can think about, if you extend this mentality to the rest of the organization and other problems that you're solving, how it not only has better software, but it improves the way that the organization or the business is functioning. And this is the kind of example that when I and other people talk about getting better at software, why you would want to do that underlayer of DevOps so that your application developers can focus on this kind of stuff. This is the kind of thing that people are really looking to achieve, and why it's important to figure out now, as we'll get into, ways of tracking that with metrics. So as I kind of said, the goal of getting to doing software better, there's a lot that goes into that, from what people actually type in their IDEs, what kind of runtime environment you're using, whether it's running things on things like Kubernetes, like the Tanzu Advanced Kubernetes Edition and things like that. Whatever, or running it on top of the Tanzu application service, the platform as a service that's out there, all sorts of other ones, all sorts of things like that. But let's focus on, once you have your platform in place for doing that, you have the developer practices and technologies to kind of get to that point with the IRS where you can study and iterate very rapidly through the best way to solve problems. What are some of the metrics that you would be tracking, right? And I think this is an area that, what you're doing with these metrics, why you're tracking them, doesn't necessarily change so much, but there are different types of metrics that you need to start looking at, because the way that you're operating, the technologies that you're using are changing as well. And there's a lot that we've learned over the past 10 or so years about metrics that are helpful to monitor if you're looking to improve the way you do your own software, as we saw with the IRS. So let's start with what I will call the DevOps or the technical metrics. And these are basically, what most people think about as metrics when it comes to, monitoring and log management, like just the stuff that you collect. And this is, part of my history long ago, back when I was a developer before I went into the world of being an industry analyst and doing corporate strategy and M&A, and now whatever it is I do now. I was a developer last at this company, BMC, and I worked on one of their systems management tools, one of the tools that would gather metrics and monitor it. And you can see some of these are actually, I had to spend a lot of time finding these, but these are actually screenshots of, I think I worked on some of these UIs here. But, traditionally these metrics are very, what would you call it? The state, they're health metrics. They tell you like, CPU and memory and storage, and don't get things wrong. You still need those metrics. You need to know the state of things, the map, if you will. But nowadays, when it comes to these kind of technical metrics, kind of in the same way that developers do better when they focus on the outcome of their software, what operations people are focusing more and more are the outcomes of what they're doing, right? And these four metrics are drawn largely from a lot of the work from the DevOps reports, if you read those over the years, and again, conversations that I've had with people who are actually putting this in place. And these four are good ones to start with. And one, there's the deployment frequency that you have. So again, let's go back to the context for all of this is we're an organization that is writing and running our own software as a way of making our business run better, like the IRS example. And so if we want to improve our software by actually observing what people are doing with it and coming up with new theories of how to best solve their problem, like having people look up what taxes they owe, then it is healthy if we are deploying more frequently, right? If it takes us 3 months to deploy software, that's not going to give us as much input as if it takes a week. And certainly when it comes to deploying security patches and other things, you want to be able to deploy freely, basically. So monitoring how frequently you can deploy an app from development into production, into whether you're doing kind of rolling upgrades or however you want to say it's in production ready to use. Keeping track of that is important, especially at the beginning, because more than likely you'll be looking to reduce that cycle down by months, if not by a very, something maybe even longer than if you're in a worse situation. But I always recommend that it's generally, unless you have a good reason, people always come up with bad reasons. But if you have a good reason to deploy more than every 2 weeks, sure, you can do that. But generally, I recommend that you should target deploying software to production at least once a week, every week, maybe every 2 weeks. And what I mean by that, it could just be a minor feature change, right? It doesn't need to be a gigantic piece of software. It could just be, we are going to change the way that data is presented on this page so that it just shows only the taxes they owe, or we are going to only show the most recent year. I don't know, you can think through all the iterations. But the point is doing these small releases, so you need to do them more frequently. So getting a handle from an operations perspective, I would almost suggest one of the responsibilities of operations is to make sure you can deploy as frequently as possible. Now, another side of that is, and this is for development and operations, but also kind of more the product manager side, is thinking, how long does it take us to come up with an idea and actually get it into production, right? So it's part of deployment of your deployment time, but it's more of that full cycle of trying something new out and thinking about it, right? And deployment frequency versus lead time and cycle time. You can go look up all sorts of great discussion about the orthodox definition of all that stuff. But it's good to start monitoring, like, how long does it take us to get a new idea into production? Something that you want to track, which you might do by monitoring your project management tools, things like that. And then, some more traditional types of things to start monitoring are not so much your uptime or pure availability. Again, one doesn't necessarily always get rid of metrics. You might just ignore them. But, sometimes whatever metrics you can get a hold of will be useful if other ones are not. So I'm not suggesting necessarily that you eliminate ones. But another one that's interesting to start tracking is your time to restore service, right? You could talk about it as MTTR, things like that. And what's important there is when you're deploying this frequently and when you're using new technologies, one of the major shifts is that things will break, right? Like it's software, it's computers, stuff breaks in them. And what's important is not so much to never break. I mean, some situations that's nice. As always, rockets, things like that. It's nice when they don't break. But also nowadays, there's a more mature way of thinking that is, let's instead focus on figuring out why stuff broke, preventing things going down as much as possible, and also recovering from that. Being able to do things, if you're using a containerized kind of a Kubernetes way to do it, it's pretty easy to relatively easy to roll back updates. Or you can do kind of a rolling upgrade where like only 10 people out of 100 use it, and you see if it breaks for them before you roll it out to everyone. But a metric, a very easy metric to track on that is how long does it take us to restore service when something goes wrong? And of course, you want to get that down as much as possible. And that's a metric that you can track ongoing to see if you're at a good level. And if something is going wonky, that means you can't do that. And then the final one to highlight is, it's good to know the overall health and capability of your organization. Like, what are the failures that get introduced with every release? What's the change failure rate? How often does it not work out? That's a good thing to start tracking as well, to know how you're doing. And again, all of these things, and this is, if you haven't read up on the way SRE people, site reliability engineering people think about metrics, there's a few more there that I think are really great ones to track as well. But there's a mindset about these kind of metrics, which is you rarely want to say that the metric should be 100% good. You don't want change failure. It's rare that you change failure rate should be 0, because what you also need to consider is, what is the cost of doing that? What would it cost us to have a change failure rate of 0? It would probably cost a lot of money, and it would also cost you a lot of time. You probably wouldn't be encouraged to release things as frequently as possible, because it would have to be perfect each time, which would increase that window of delivery, which would kind of defeat the main tool you have for improving the way that you do your software. So let's look at just a one example of something else that becomes new in when you're running your applications in a cloud way, especially when you're running on a container-oriented architecture like Kubernetes or some of the platforms as a services out there. And that is thinking about how you're doing tracing, how you're not only monitoring how common workflows or common processes from a user perspective are in an application, but also tracking down what went wrong. And way back when I was doing this stuff, tracing was important as well. And there's application performance monitoring, APM, that does tracing as well. But nowadays, because you're changing the infrastructure and the stacks that software are running on, this becomes a renewed concern as well, is how do I make sure that I'm giving the developers who write their application software the frameworks and the kind of the hooks needed to enable full end-to-end tracing. Technically it's a challenging thing to do, but essentially when it comes to tracing, what you're doing is you're asking your developers to more or less I'm simplifying it, but here is a token that identifies, as you can see in the sequence diagram, this whole user request. And every time you log about something or you say you're doing something, use this token so that we can go back in and kind of pull it all together, right? And I remember working on this kind of stuff. It can be technically challenging, but in using a platform like Kubernetes or like the Tanzu application service, because you set up the standard way of doing tracing, this stuff becomes quite easy because it's built into that framework. But you as the operations people or the platform operations people doing this, you really want to start thinking about how can we standardize on how tracing is done instead of kind of dealing with developers figuring that out on their own, or worse, after the fact, trying to sort through all the logs and the metrics to kind of synthetically pull together a trace instead of it being done for you. So there's a lot of great stuff written up about tracing, and there's all sorts of frameworks, especially if you're using Spring for your Java apps. That's built in there, and there's good stuff that you can use to put tracing in there, but make sure you're considering that. So next, let's look at the kind of business metrics. You could also call these product metrics if you want to think in a product-centric way about your software, but we'll say business because that sounds fancy. Now, as I've mentioned several times, right? Like when you look at surveys, and it kind of matches what you intuitively would think, which is developers don't spend a lot of time thinking about the business metrics for what they have, right? And to be fair, it's not because they necessarily should, according to their job description, the way most organizations are set up and the culture that they have, really looks for developers to just write the code and have as few bugs as possible and deliver it on time and have quality, schedule, and budget. The iron triangle of impossibility, as you can look that up if you're interested. Developers aren't sort of encouraged to think about how they fit into the overall thing. Now, in, I think, better functioning organizations, they are. And so these are not only metrics that you would want your kind of product managers to think about, or the kind of management over these developers to make sure that they're helping out on the business side, or especially the business side. But it's good for developers to have access to this as well. And you'll find that if developers know the success of how their software is being used, it's actually a pretty good morale booster for them and encourages them to work more. And developers also love solving problems. So if they see that their software isn't being used, isn't successful at solving problems for people, it will be something that they'll not necessarily get depressed about, but they'll want to. It'll encourage them to go and solve that problem. So finding these metrics is, I always hate the phrase "it depends," but a lot of it does depend on what your business is. And I tried to collect together a couple of examples that are kind of general things to kind of get you started, right? And how you figure out what these metrics are. Think about what your business is trying to accomplish, right? If you think back to the IRS example, in that specific example, what they were trying to accomplish was, we would like less people to call us, right? So you can track that. There's been a decrease in people calling. We would also like people to be able to find how much money they owe and go through the full cycle of paying it, right? That's an easy enough thing to track. So forth and so on, right? So that kind of workflow. Now, speaking of, that's a very common business metric that you can track, is not only completing workflow, like buying something or filling out an application, but also the time it takes to go through a workflow, right? Like if I want to apply for insurance or a mortgage, or if I'm more in the back office and I want to, here's one that I'm sure anyone working in a large organization would like. How long does it take for an employee to procure something? What's the complete end-to-end workflow for that? So measuring how long workflow takes, how many errors it happens, like the success of it, is a great business metric to go through, right? So think about what those workflows are and how you would measure whether you complete a sale or you just complete a workflow. Like what's the cycle time, more or less, on how your business is functioning? And is your software helping that out? Now, of course, there's things like use. That's easy to monitor. This is particularly good if you're trying to find features that you shouldn't prioritize anymore. If no one's using them, probably not a good idea to keep supporting them. And then, of course, there's the basics of like, how much does it cost in terms of time and money to do this software, to support it? You can break things down to, cost per transaction. And then finally, depending on how you measure it, this gets annoying after a while. I'm sure you, like I experience this, where people, various apps always want to know how I'm doing, if I enjoy it. And nowadays I just always, don't fill it out unless it's, I find the thumbs up, thumbs down thing is pretty easy. That's fine to do. Although I guess there's a third thing they didn't want to tell me. That would be interesting to track. But somehow figure out how you can get the sentiment of your customers. What's their experience and satisfaction apart from the workflow or completing things, and kind of get a handle on that. And again, the business obviously should want to know these things, and your developers and operations people, they should, these numbers should be good if they are doing good work themselves, right? Again, you want to get out of the state where the developers are like, worked on my laptop, right? I did what you asked me to, and I'm out, and I'm not going to apply my thinking or anything to solve the overall problems there. So, one thing to highlight there that I think it's hard for me to fit this into what the metric is. And it's kind of a technical one, but also I kind of think of it as a business capability, a way of managing how your business is functioning. And that is somehow thinking about how you're measuring, you could call it your technical debt, or the effect that legacy software, you call it heritage software, whatever you like, the effect that legacy software is having on your organization, on your software. And so, as you can see from this quote and some other figures from the survey down there, this is being held back by your existing set of software and governance and practices, being held back by how you do things today, is one of the top three concerns, if not sometimes the top concern that organizations have, right? So if you think about, you want to improve how your your organization functions by improving your software, then you're going to change how you think about your software, deploying every week and taking a more product design driven approach to your software. Well, if you think to that, you've got to integrate with existing systems to pull whatever that, whether it's transactions people have had, or look through different ERP systems about what's going on in your supply chain, or integrate together with some, your main insurance book app on your mainframe. Like, if the systems that you're relying on and the governance frameworks that you're operating under on, the norms are, sort of not only yesterday's, but the last decade's way of thinking, where things were done differently, then you're going to be held back and negatively affected by that part of your system, by that part of your entire organization. And so, how you exactly measure that negative effect and your improvement of it, again, I don't quite know what that would be, but it's worth thinking through what that is and how you would do that in your organization. It might be something about, for this set of tickets that we have, how many times is a ticket sent in to get access to the ERP system, right? And what is the reply time to do that? How long does it take developers to just set up their dev test environment? How long does it take to get network configuration done? If we wanted to go to an old application and we didn't want to change anything about that application, and we just wanted to redeploy that application, how long would it take to redeploy that application? Or how long would it take to deploy one line of code on an older application? It's worth going through some thought exercises to think about, how do we measure what this drag is we have from our existing services? Because not very rapidly, but right now, today, it's something that really holds organizations back from getting better at software and improving the way that they operate. So then finally, let's look at the what people call culture, right? And I think of as culture, there's another talk that I give every now and then, kind of defining what culture is and going over what good cultures look like, and how people change those cultures if they're looking to improve how they do software. All the great stuff I've been mentioning here. What people generally mean, what I take people to mean culture, is the flippant way of putting it is just how we do things around here, right? How we operate, the norms that we act under, the governance that we follow, the way the organization is set up, the roles that people have, how they interact. It's just, that's kind of what a large part of what culture is in real life, with all the cultural artifacts that go with it, but just how people work with each other, how they do things, and how they operate. So when you're changing the way that you're doing your software, you're effectively also changing a lot about your culture, right? The organization shifts over to have different types of teams of developers and product managers who have a lot more responsibility over the end product, a lot more ownership. So that's a big shift. Operations people tend to treat developers more as customers rather than kind of inmates that they're managing in their platforms and their big enterprise architectures, right? They partner with them more. And when you hear about how those big, large tech companies operate, you can tell that they have a different culture, a different way of operating than more traditional organizations. So largely, I think that this culture thing, in the same way that developers kind of own software, operations people own the infrastructure, the runtime, the platform things are running on, I feel like the culture ultimately is owned by management, by the executives, right? The culture is the factory of the organization, metaphorically speaking, how things get done. And so it should be something in the same way that you would monitor a factory or anything vital like that. It's something that you want to pay attention to and always make sure is running the best. And therefore, there's probably some metrics that you want to track on it. Now, as with the business metrics, things will depend on where you're coming from, what you're going to. what's measurable, what you want to do in your organization. But here's some to pay attention to kind of start with as you expand out more. And, in my most recent book, I write up some more thinking here. It's fun to think about all sorts of metrics you could find depending on your situation. So one of them, and a lot of these you can see are kind of reverse engineering how you would track a qualitative thing with more of a quantitative thing. So as you're changing your culture, it generally, all of the advice you have about changing how you operate, if you want to do better at software, at DevOps, a lot of it revolves around your employees being happier, right? And that happiness deriving from they feel they have more psychological safety about how they're doing their work. They have more creativity and responsibility. They have all these things that people actually enjoy in their job. And that especially when it comes to a creative endeavor like software and even running that software, you want people to be motivated to do the right thing. You want them to be happy with what they're doing, not just doing what they're told or, trying to get away with as little as possible because they're not happy in their job. So one of the ways of kind of measuring that is to pretty regularly, not too annoyingly, but take an employee NPS. Now, a net promoter score is a thing, I believe it's Bain who came up with this. And if you don't know what an NPS is, it's, in my opinion, a little overly complicated the way that it's done. But to simplify it for you, you basically ask people, a normal NPS is, would you recommend this product or service to your friend, right? And an employee NPS is, would you recommend this job or to a friend or a loved one, right? And what's great about the NPS metric is it's not asking what someone's reaction to it is, what they think of it. It's involving them more, committing them more to that decision to say, would you put your reputation on the line with someone that you like and subject them to the negative or the positive of this, right? And it's proven over many decades to be a great way of tracking sentiment around things. So, figure that out, right? And figure out tracking that. And you could just straight up ask it. And, you can go look up the technicals of NPS stuff, but it's something that you can start asking around about. Now, the next one is another kind of survey thing. And it's a lot easier to get if you can actually physically be in the same place and kind of do the metric gathering by walking around. And that is getting a sense of like the belief that your staff has and the strategy that you have and the leadership in place, the belief in that culture. And a lot of that is done by, you can kind of qualitatively measure the questions people are asking, kind of get the sentiment. You can also just ask them if they believe in the strategy. And, equally important is if they're clear on what the strategy is, right? And, it's important that people understand what they're doing and why they're doing it, right? And again, think back to that IRS example. You would want the people working on those screens to understand the goal they had and to think about how can we solve that goal as much as possible, rather than just like, oh, you gave me some wireframes, I'm going to implement the wireframes, right? You want them to be more involved and more committed to coming up with the way they're solving that problem. And one of the ways to do that is to really track their knowledge of and belief in the strategy. So that's another survey thing that's good to look for. Now, another one, which is kind of about like your deployment frequency and things like that. But if you remember to that IRS example, I mentioned that they went through several theories or ideas of how to do the UI best, right? And so one of the metrics that I first, many years ago, heard about a CEO at a big US retailer tracking who was switching over and has since switched over to thinking about software in this way, thinking about software as one of the primary storefronts of how they interact with their customers, and therefore a core way that they run their business. Is that CEO is interested in how many experiments their teams had gone through, right? Of course, they're interested in, are you done? Have you delivered the feature? How is the business functioning? But a sign of a healthy culture is that the people are trying things out. They're taking risks, if you will, and they're experimenting with new things, right? You want to try as many things as possible, as makes sense. You want to learn as much as possible so that you improve, right? And that, you should be able to plug into your project management systems, things like that, to kind of get a sense of tracking the number of experiments that you have. If you've ever like heard about the Flow framework and the company behind that TaskTop, they do a good job of kind of demonstrating how you could automate pulling that kind of information if you need to do it at scale. But it's good to know how well you're doing there. So. And then just, the basics, it's really important to start paying attention to your staff retention and churn rate. Like it's always good to have a pretty small churn rate, get new people in there. and let them figure out doing things like that. But you don't want to go too far with it. So then when it comes to metrics in general, like just two more things, and then I'll let you go off to figure out what would be good to put in your dashboard. So one of the other things you can get with metrics, not only when it comes to working with people about how you're changing the organization, both people, sort of individual contributors, staff, if you will, who are often resistant to change, but also the entire rest of your organization, which is often suspicious of change, might be competing with you about they want to change things in a new way over there. This VP wants to do something in a different way. They want the budget and the time that you're using to try to get your part of the business to change and improve, right? So you always are thinking about, how do I build up trust and validation that what we're doing works, right? And providing transparency of a lot of these metrics, not hiding them, but showing them and showing hopefully how they're improving over time, or if they're not improving, how you're trying new things, right? How you're not just stuck on the same thing. And ultimately, if it doesn't improve things, how you're deciding something different to do. Having transparency over that and showing that not only to the staff in your organization, but also your organization as a whole, that will do a tremendous amount of what I would call internal marketing, but building up trust that things are going well, that you're making good decisions. Even if you're changing what the operational things that you're doing are, it shows that you're trying, that you're working, that you're learning, that you're improving by learning and trying out new things. And so it's good to think about how you can use metrics, not only to report on the state of your system, but to report back to yourself and the organization about how you're doing, how your work is doing, and to try to win people over. So then finally, another critical thing that comes up a lot that is important to codify into your culture and how you think about metrics is very regularly go through and cull out the zombie metrics that you have, right? So oftentimes, I kind of, mentioned, I'm not talking about getting rid of metrics, but sometimes there are metrics that you may be monitoring, and especially when it comes to governance and things like that, and you don't really ever use them, and you're spending a lot of effort not only gathering them, but you have to spend the kind of cognitive effort to kind of filter them out because no one cares about them anymore. And every time someone new comes about, you've got to explain this metric doesn't apply. So it's really worth your while to think about, I don't know what the period is. I'm sure at first it's good to visit all the metrics you have. And then maybe 3 months later, visit them again, maybe 6 months after that. And then until maybe on an annual basis, you're kind of reevaluating the metrics that you have. It's good to go through and think about, do we still need to be collecting this? Or is this just noise and bother and toil that we're dealing with? Because as with your legacy systems and software, a lot of the problems that large organizations in particular encounter very rapidly is they don't go and garden out a lot of the stuff that they have, and they get stuck with things that they could have just gotten rid of. They're wasting their time and resources. So that's a little introduction, my suggestion to how, if you're thinking about changing the way you're doing software, if you're interested in DevOps, if you're kind of involved in a project of running on top of a platform as a service like the Tanzu application service, or you're involved in we need to start running on multi-cloud or Kubernetes, or our developers and our support is moving over to this new platform to do software in a new way. You're going to need to, especially at the management level and above, you need to start thinking about the metrics that you'll be tracking. So hopefully you have some start for that. There's, if you want to track down those books, all sorts of other things related to this. This is the kind of thing that I spend that transformation a lot of my time on. I'm easy enough to track down there. I'm always happy to, my mean time to respond to email isn't always as good as it could be, but you can always email me, and there's a way to get a hold of me in Twitter if you want to reach out to me there. So also, you should definitely take your survey. I like to encourage people to rate me as highly as possible. If you think you didn't enjoy this talk at all, no need to take the survey. Just do it if you think I did a good job. I joke. It actually is good to know, especially if you have some thoughts on this or things I missed. It'd be great to hear what those are. That helps me improve it for next time. But as with all the sessions, it's good to do the survey. And with that, thank you. I appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of the conference.